A fed nation is a free nation, and a nation that can sustain itself with food, fiber, and energy is one that can be independent and not reliant on other countries.
Today, we dive into what it really takes to keep America free and strong, a food system that supports family farms and ranches, because a country that can feed itself stands independent.
Once the American cattle rancher realizes that we are truly one of the last really independent-minded groups in this country, and we have the land, we have the ability to have livestock on that land, we have all the bargaining chips.
I'm joined by Amanda Radke, rancher, author, speaker, and podcaster, who will share powerful insights on protecting private property rights, revitalizing rural America, and uniting as cattle producers.
You can keep it within the family and honor those multi-generational traditions that have been established. That is what really makes America the greatest country on planet Earth.
Keeping America fed and free on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi, everyone, and we welcome you to this Independence Day edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Good to have you here with us, and no doubt for a lot of folks listening all across the country, and maybe you're listening later on than when this actually aired on the show, but no doubt when you look at that this time of the year in July and celebrating Independence Day, it's a time where we often do the things that we did growing up, whether that's going to a parade or going to a rodeo or a family reunion, whatever that might be. Maybe it's a vacation trip, who knows? But there's a lot of things that brings back memories of how we grew up, and no doubt I hope you're able to establish that with your families as well. Again, good to have you here on our program. As you heard there in the opening, very pleased to have Amanda Radke joining us here on our program today. A very insightful show. I think you'll appreciate the tone and the take that we have on our program here today, looking and reflecting on the fact that it is important for a country that it wants to remain sovereign and free to be able to produce its own food and fiber. And I think you're going to enjoy our conversation that we have here today with Amanda. Now, before we get too far, I did want to mention some of the previous shows that we've had. Boy, we've had some really good dynamic shows here throughout the first part of last part of spring, first part of summer, I should say. But you go back to last week's show, episode 218, we talked about what actually pays a net premium on your calves when you get ready to sell them this fall. It's never too late to be looking at things like that. Also, we had in episode 217, taking the mystique out of low-stress stockmanship with Don Nato, a great show there. And, of course, back to 216, Dr. Alan Williams with Understanding Ag LLC joining us. Tips for summer grazing. Definitely, again, another subject that's not too late. And it's a subject, any of those shows that we talked about are going to be shows that you can listen to at any point in time and find some real value in those. So if you want to find and go listen to them, you can go to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or you can find it on your local podcast provider as well. Well, as we turn towards our subject here today, joining us on our program is Amanda Radke. She and her husband ranch out of the Mitchell area of central South Dakota. She's also the mother of 4 children, an author, a motivational speaker, and a podcaster, a podcast entitled The Heart of Rural America. And Amanda, so good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So our subject here today, in the vein of trying to have some sort of patriotic type theme, I was kind of searching through things. And one of the things in my head that just kept coming back was the fact that if you're a country that has the ability to produce its own food and fiber, and of course for you and I, we're both from the ranching side of things, so that's the perspective that we're going to be talking about here today. There's a lot of strength there. And I think the concern is the fact that how do we get that message out to the rest of the world to know that, boy, it is important for a country, that strength there, when a country is able to do that. And I think when we look at this Independence Day and 4th of July and take the word Independence Day, there's a lot to hang in that word independence when you're a country that can produce your own food and fiber.
Absolutely. Well, a fed nation is a free nation, and a nation that can sustain itself with food, fiber, and energy is one that can be independent and not reliant on other countries. And so I think American agriculturalists, family farms and ranches are a global success story. There's less than 2% of us involved in production agriculture today. And Americans spend less than 10% of their disposable income on food. So we have the most affordable and abundant food supply on planet Earth, so much so that 40% of it ends up in landfills, wasted, because we have that abundance. And with that, though, I think there comes taking advantage of, or a taking for granted, for a better word, that the food is just readily available. And so what happens if our food supply becomes vulnerable? Well, then terrible things can start happening to a society. And so that's why agriculture really is the backbone of a free nation.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, as I said before, and I've seen this over the years, I've always referred to it as the fact that it used to be that people would say our grandparents grew up on, I used to go to my grandparents' farm. That's not even no longer happening. We see our society continue to move further and further away from the family farm, or knowing grandma and grandpa's or great grandma and grandpa's family farm. And that process, that gap that's there, is really the big hurdle in some of this, as far as from a country standpoint, of then recognizing that and being willing to, and we're fighting from it on every corner, aren't we?
We absolutely are. There is an incrementalism happening in this country that is taking families off the land and really creating a consolidation and corporatization of our food supply. And I guess I started really looking at this during COVID, when kind of the world shut down. And I had gotten a call from a gentleman I had met in an airport randomly when I was speaking out in New York City. And this gentleman was living through a global pandemic in the Big Apple. He went to the grocery store and all he wanted to do was buy some hamburger for his family, and the shelves were bare. And he called me and was like, "Hey, Amanda, do you ship beef?" And it was a light bulb moment for me, because I realized our food supply isn't too big to fail. There are systems in place that, yes, allows us to feed a huge population of people here and around the world, but 85% of our beef supply is held captive in a monopoly by 4 major players, 2 that are foreign owned. We saw during that time, processors weren't processing hogs, and hog farmers were having to euthanize their pigs and pile them up in dead piles. We saw dairy farmers that were having to dump their milk because the plastic bottles were on some ship somewhere in a port and the labor wasn't there while the world shut down to get those bottles unpackaged and heading to the dairies. And I realized, man, we're seeing all these things happen that show me that our food supply has vulnerabilities. But at the same time, you and I in production agriculture, it was business as usual. We were calving the cows, feeding the cattle, putting up the hay, planting the corn. And I realized there has to be some solutions to this, to connect urban and rural America, to reward farmers and ranchers who are doing the work to actually provide the food. And somewhere along the way, there's been this disconnect. And so what I've found kind of in my work and in the businesses I have is, the second I was able to step outside of maybe a system that is broken in many ways, and I don't see a political will to necessarily address some of these problems I see, was the second 2 things were accomplished. Number 1, we could bring premiums and dollars back to rural America, and we could also build relationships with people in urban cities that we wanted to serve. So long story short, this gentleman that called me, he was able to buy beef and have it shipped directly to his door during the middle of a global pandemic. And to me, that highlighted, hey, there are opportunities in agriculture, but we've got to start looking for them. And when we do that, really good things could start happening.
Amanda, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about when we were going through COVID. I think, it was definitely a very, very difficult time in not only for our nation, but industry wide for various different reasons, and not just our industry, lots of different industries, of course. But as we are now, 4 or 5 years out of that, there's some silver lining in some of that. And when I talk about that disconnect, we kind of saw that people realization, like you were just giving the example of people saying, wow, we need to know where our food comes from. I mean, is that what you felt coming out of COVID? If there was a silver lining in some element of what we went through?
For me, I travel across the country speaking at agricultural conferences. Really, my passion is working with farm families and helping them think outside of the box and be innovative and creative entrepreneurs. Because at the end of the day, if these farms and ranches are not profitable, they're not sustainable. The families can't stay on the land. And I'm really troubled as I travel this country and put on so many miles, as I would drive through rural small towns and I would see, the Main Street businesses were sitting empty. The school and the church were barely hanging on. There might be one gas station and a grocery store, but these once booming towns are now sitting empty. And I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how can we turn that tide around? And COVID, although it presented many hardships, also did present those opportunities. I was talking to families that were, selling out of their beef. They were parking their meat trucks in the Walmart parking lot and selling out. I saw young first-generation farm families starting from scratch, beef tallow skincare businesses. Or one kid I met was a 16-year-old kid in Kansas. And when the school shut down during COVID, he bought a 3D printer and started making face shields that he donated to local hospitals. But it's since, emerged into this big booming business, and he was saving money for a car and to go to college. And so in hardships, when everybody's freaking out, I often think that that's where, instead of running away from the fire, that's where we need to run to the fire. And so right now in the beef industry, really for all the wrong reasons, all the political things that have hurt us for so many years has led to this point where we're at the lowest cow herd we've seen in a generation. And, we're losing, I think we've lost, I read 400 million acres of farm ground here in recent years to development and solar and wind and housing. So we're seeing the gobbling up of our farm ground. We are seeing fewer and fewer ranches in the beef industry. In fact, I think we've lost 107,000 independent cow-calf producers in the last 5 years. So over 20,000 a year that we're losing. And so for all the wrong reasons, we're seeing just kind of the carving out of the independent family cattle rancher. But for those that have hung on and have stuck with it and have been in the grind, they're still here. There are opportunities because the supply is not there. The American consumer and the global consumer loves what we do because, quite frankly, nobody can raise grain-fed, highly marbled, flavorful beef like the American cattle rancher can do. And so I think the future looks bright. There's a lot of excitement, and I'm personally excited. Tyler and I are leaning into it harder than ever at our own cattle ranch. We started a beef company with some partners called Bid on Beef. It's in its first year. So we just celebrated our first anniversary here in June, but it's an auction platform where we work with different ranches all across the country, and they sell their beef like a cattle auction. So consumers can bid, and they can bid on the ribeye steak, and they get to choose the price. And we just last week celebrated a milestone where we sold to our 50th state, and that was Alaska, was the last holdout. So we've sold to 50 states, and people are just so excited to be able to know the rancher, ask them questions, and it's also been just so rewarding and edifying to see these dollars flow straight back to the family farm and ranch. And so that's what gets me fired up. And my encouragement to people right now, if they're in the cattle business or they're in production ag, we can lean heavily on past traditions and on the work ethic and the grit and the pride of having these multi-generational operations. But I think with the changing of times, we also have to really think outside the box, be willing to have the neighbors laugh at us and make fun of us, and dare to be different or try something new, because it might be that one idea that you have within you that hasn't been thought of before. If you identify a problem and you can provide the solution and you can find a customer that's willing to pay you a premium, it starts getting really exciting and fun in this beef cattle business.
Yeah. Amanda, let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to go a little bit further into what you feel could be the things that are going to be the bigger challenges. And I'm not talking about just like the challenges we're facing this year. I'm talking about, multi-generational challenges that you foresee agriculture, specifically ranching, having to deal with, and identifying those, and then, where we could be going and looking at from there. I want to talk about that when we come back. This segment today brought to you by K-Line Irrigation, a cost-effective adaptive irrigation solution designed specifically with the grass-based livestock producer in mind.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-Line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-Line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-Line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
Welcome back, Amanda. I want to talk a little bit now, as we were talking there at the break, a couple challenges that I want to just get your take on when it comes to what I sort of see as being big challenges for agriculture and, of course, from a ranching perspective. Number one would be just getting the ranch passed on. Mm-hmm. And I, as I was telling you, I've done multiple shows on estate planning, and we can do all the shows we want to. We can beat that drum all we want to, but it's still a tough thing to do. And I see that being a really big challenge to agriculture and just in general. You're on the road a lot. I know you talk to a lot of guys. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I talk about this a lot in my speeches about the challenges of multi-generational operations, and you're dealing with on and off farm siblings, you're dealing with aging parents, you've got in-laws, you've got a lot of different voices that have opinions on what that should look like. Fair is not always equal, and equal isn't always fair. And a few things I see, I'm not saying I have a silver bullet because no operation is the same, but I do notice some common themes. Number one, the younger generation. I was the same way. I came home after college and it was like I was the smartest person ever. I learned all this stuff. Dad, I'm going to just, come in and have all these things I want to change. And there was resistance there. And so for young people, I think it's really important. A few things. Number one, go get some industry experience. Go see the world. Go learn from other operations. See what successful ranches or companies are doing. How do they structure their businesses? How do they make good hires? How do they create a team? Because sometimes the best employee for your ranch isn't even a family member. It might actually be a detriment. So how do you build a great team, a great system? How do you play to the individual strengths of the people within that family operation? Also for young people, I think sometimes they overvalue their sweat equity, meaning you might be there doing all the work. And trust me, I've been right next to my dad doing all the work. But unless it's written down on paper of what that sweat equity means, how that you will be repaid for that. And you might be being compensated very well for the work you're doing right now, especially if you get a ranch truck and a house to live in or all the other benefits that come with the wage that you might be getting on that operation. And so sometimes there is that assumption that's made that if I stick by mom and dad and I help them build this business, they'll make it right for me at the end. And that's a dangerous assumption to make if it's not written down. And I've seen a lot of heartache there. On the older generation, I think what I see a lot of is there's a denial that they're going to die or need to retire. That's just not going to happen. And so they kick the can and avoid those conversations, and they fail to communicate their vision for their assets that they've acquired over time. And I think having that sit down meeting with that younger generation to say, we got to put entitlements aside. We've got to put what we think should happen aside. Mom and dad, what is your intention? What does your retirement look like? How do you plan to transition these assets? Is there a buy-in option or a sell option? What do those tangibles look like? And if that plan is clearly communicated with all the siblings, I think we avoid a lot of heartache and families where they don't even get together at Christmas time anymore. And like I said, I don't have a silver silver bullet, but I do think having those clear lines of communication and honestly valuing, having things on paper so that there's no guesswork to it. I think that could avoid a lot of heartache.
Yeah. So we're going to transition. That kind of leads me into the next thing. And part of it was, as you were talking there, the thing that I see happening a lot, and my immediate family, for me and my brothers and sisters, it happened with our ranch that we grew up on, and I see it happening in others, is that in order for everything to be fair, a place that once sustained or barely sustained one family gets split multiple ways, and then it's really unsustainable. And it goes into the conversation I want to get to now, in the fact that, and I remember looking over data years and years ago of, as the USDA classifies producers by small, medium, and large, and we saw that the mediums ranchers were going away, and we were seeing more large ranchers or farms and more small ones, which would be probably considered in some way, not to be criticizing of anybody, but would be more considered a hobby type deal, or definitely not anything that somebody's making a full living on. You saw an increase in the small, increase in the large. And as I said, I'm a capitalist. I believe that if somebody can grow and they're able to make it work, they need to have that ability to do that. And so the thing that I struggle with a little bit is, and as I preface this, the fact that we see some of these family farms and ranches being split up into smaller things that are not sustainable. We're almost cutting our legs out from underneath us.
Well, it begs the question, what are you prioritizing? Do you want to keep that family business intact, or do you want to equitably divide the assets, which really is the land piece? And when you're talking some of this farm ground, it's worth a lot of money. And so what are you prioritizing? And then how do you make it right with those off-farm siblings? I think that's a good question. I think there's a larger theme at play here is we're outsourcing our best talent outside of rural America, outside of our farming and ranching communities, meaning there's a generation of kids, and myself included. My parents told me from a young age, don't get into the cattle business. You're going to work really hard. You're going to work nonstop. It's capital intensive. It's risky. And we want better for you. And so I did. When I was in college, I lived in Washington, D.C., and Denver, in Minneapolis, in Argentina, and I learned a lot. But one thing I realized was I didn't belong in a concrete jungle. I belonged in where cattle pastures were, and I could see the stars and where my roots were. But I see, there's a lot of young people that wish they could be in production agriculture, but incrementally, the opportunity doesn't exist. And why? Because we're like the frog in the boiling pot of water. We don't realize that between animal rights activists, climate change extremists, politicians who have created a hostile regulatory environment for farmers and ranchers to operate under, the attacks on our private property rights, the gobbling up of our farm ground because of the government picking winners and losers in agriculture and subsidizing one thing at the expense of another. As an example, here where I'm at in South Dakota, I'm along the James River. And, when corn prices got so high, and then of course there's that safety net from the federal government, every blade of grass that could have possibly been plowed up, whether it should have or not, was plowed up. And so you see this skew of, rewarding one industry while another one, slowly dies. And so I see some greater issues there that if we perked up our heads enough to pay attention to, we would pay attention to this meat packer monopoly. We would pay attention to the encroachment of our private property rights, whether it is through mandatory EID or, attacks on our land through Green New Deal initiatives like the carbon sequestration pipeline that I fought in South Dakota. We would advocate for, yes, small and limited government, but let's prioritize things like investing in small and mid-sized processing plants so they're closer to the producer instead of further away. We would look at, protecting our land access. Like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing developers come in and just gobble this farm ground up. And how can a young farmer wanting to get back into business compete with a guy like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates? Even our land grant universities have gone the way of prioritizing things like climate change instead of, hey, how do I match the right livestock and crop production plan to the environment and the acres I have available to me. And then how do I maximize every animal and every acre I have and make this a profitable business? So I'm seeing just a lot of agendas that exist today that really do make it increasingly difficult for young people to get in agriculture. And I think once families start paying attention to that and getting vocal and not just accepting that that's how the way it is, maybe we could turn the tides around and create these booming rural communities that we once had growing up.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, we'll take a break here. And when we come back, I want to take what you just talked about and then start talking about, okay, where do we move forward? Again, the point of our show here today is a country that is strong is a country that can provide its own food and fiber. And we're getting back to the point of we need to find ways to revitalize and to continue on with production agriculture. So I want to dive kind of into that subject when we come back here on the program. This segment today brought to you by the Man Saver Post Driver by Rohr Manufacturing. When it comes to building fence, driving those steel posts can be exhausting and absolutely backbreaking. But there is another way you could be doing this. Now, I'm not talking about those bulky and expensive gas-powered or hydraulic pounders. What I'm talking about is the Man Saver Post Driver. Yeah, it's called the Man Saver Post Driver by Rohr Manufacturing. This is a portable, lightweight, easy-to-use post driver that runs off of any small air compressor and is 100% made in the USA. The Man Saver Post Driver comes in a variety of models from driving posts ranging from vineyard stakes to T-posts and all the way up to 3.5-inch diameter posts. While it may be called the Man Saver Post Driver, shoot, I've heard some go as far as calling it the Marriage Saver Post Driver. But take a look for yourself. See it in action when you go to their website at rohrmfg.com. That's ROHRERMFG.com. Or if you want to talk to a real person, give them a call at 800-980-7599. The Man Saver Post Driver, the portable, lightweight, and easy-to-use pneumatic post driver where the name speaks for itself. Welcome back. My guest today is Amanda Radke. Her and her husband and family, they ranch in Mitchell, South Dakota. She is an author, a speaker. You've done a lot of things, Amanda, and so it's good to have you here on the program today. It's interesting to visit with you because with your the scope of things that you've done, not only as a producing rancher yourself, your family, but also somebody that's out on the road and seeing a lot of different things. As we are talking about here, the core of our program is really looking at on this Independence Day weekend is looking at the fact that a country that is going to survive and be a healthy country in our world today is going to be a country that can produce its own food and fiber. And we've identified the fact, as you were saying in the previous segment, that as ranchers, we need to get our heads up. We need to know that there's things coming at us so that we don't continue to see the shrinking of the industry that we have seen over the many, many years. And so as we look ahead into this, when you look at what we as an industry should be doing so that we not only maintain the strength that we have as a country that's producing food and fiber, what do you feel are the steps or the things that we really need to be moving forward on and be doing?
Sure. Well, to me, it really dials down to one thing, and that is the land. George Washington said private property rights and freedom go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And one of the things I really want to make sure the American cattle rancher remembers, and what makes us so great, that's who our community is that we have the land, meaning we have leverage. I think in the wrong hands, we can look back in history of any communist regime, any takeover of a country in historical times, and a lot of it boiled down to food, because he who controls the land controls the food, and who controls the food controls the people. And I've kind of had to learn this the hard way through this Green New Deal boondoggle that came into South Dakota, and they felt like they were entitled to use eminent domain to seize land from farmers and ranchers for their own corporate project. By the way, there was ties to Saudi Arabia, so we're really talking about like a foreign land grab here. And I really had to take a hard look at what does it mean to be a landowner. And once the American cattle rancher realizes that we are truly one of the last really independent-minded groups in this country, and we have the land, we have the ability to have livestock on that land, and in turn, we have the ability to convert inedible cellulosic material, which is grass and other feedstuffs, into the most nutrient-rich powerhouse food on planet Earth, plus 100 byproducts with that beef animal that God so perfectly designed to be on land that otherwise would sit barren and be a wasteland in a lot of places. Once we realize that, we have all the bargaining chips. And yet the mistake I see in our community all the time, because a lot of guys are cash strapped, a lot of guys are kind of backed into a corner. And so they start getting into bed with organizations or groups or people that don't have their long-term best interests in mind. Meaning when you open the door to sign an easement or to go into a partnership with something, you might be getting paid really well up front for whatever carbon program that exists or whatever the big sales pitch is. But my message to folks is be very careful, because the devil is in the details. And what are you giving up in turn for this, really exciting payment? What access are you giving to this ground? And once you give access to someone who doesn't have your best intentions in mind, it's very hard. You lose all your leverage. And so for me, fighting animal rights activists and seeing what these climate change extremists have done, they both perpetuate that they care about the animals or they care about the environment. But really what it is they care about what you have, which is your private property. And once we give up our ability to own and manage our land and our livestock as we see fit, that's when this cattle industry is over. And so my call to action to people is to remember that this land is worth protecting and worth fighting for. It is a huge achievement if you can keep it within the family and honor those multi-generational traditions that have been established. That is what really makes America the greatest country on planet Earth. I really believe the American cattleman is a huge part of our nation's history and what makes it great. And if you can honor that and try to preserve some of that, man, I mean, what a worthy and noble cause that is. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that in just today's society, where there's so much chaos and noise and all of these things and opportunities that maybe are traps instead of opportunities are coming at us all the time.
Mm-hmm. As you're talking about that, Amanda, we need to understand that we have the chips when we have the land. But the other side of that too, in some of this, is as an industry, we fight within ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get into picking specific groups out. That's not about what we're going to do here today. And I know you don't want to do that either. But at the same time, we know everybody that just heard that comment knows exactly what I'm talking about in that. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the things that you just said there, your opening statement to that last question, I really do feel that about all of us in the ranching industry can agree on that. And I think all of that to be said is getting back to some of those things that, we really can't agree on. And we have to be united in this, because we can talk about all we want here today about passing it down to the next generation or fighting climate change activists or animal rights and that kind of a stuff. It's just a tough deal, because then we start getting into these higher issues that we don't agree on. And that drives the boat on the things we do agree on.
Right. Well, at the end of the day, yes, I know very well the tensions between the ag groups. I've spoke at them all. I'm a member of none, mostly because I just wanted to be, early on in my career, I had decided I wanted to be able to, critically think about all issues and report on them fairly without a bias of an association, kind of pushing my thoughts. And so I have great friends in all of them, and we have these rich conversations and debates at times. But at the end of the day, one thing that unites us all is we are Americans, and standing by the Constitution of what policies protect the individual, because it is the individual farmer and rancher that I think we should all be concerned about. It's not building a food system where we're cogs in a wheel and just a part of a system where we're feeding the world and, you should just be honored to be a part of this big puzzle. No. It is the individual family, the grandpa and grandma, the mom and dad raising the young kids, teaching them how to work the land and plant the seeds and take care of the cattle and pass all of those traditions and that knowledge on generation to generation. That's what we should be trying to protect and preserve, because the future, if I play it out in 20 years' time, if we continue on the trajectory we are on, there's not too many of us left in production agriculture. There's not too many families still after it. There's a bunch of big corporations, big global hubs, and there's food deserts. And there's not many people that are actually engaged in production agriculture unless they're working for one of those big players. And that's not really a future I want. I believe in order to have a free and fed nation requires many hands. It requires a diverse amount of people spread all over the United States. One of my business partners I work with at Bid on Beef is Chris Earl in New Mexico. How he manages his cattle in New Mexico is so much different than how I manage my cattle in South Dakota. And yet both are required, because if they got gobbled up and just consolidated into some, one major hub, that doesn't create opportunities. It doesn't build communities. It doesn't ensure that we have access to food all across the nation, from the most rural points to the biggest urban cities. And so many hands, a diverse amount of people involved, and families on the land. I think if all the associations got together and agreed on that one thing, and they stuck to how do we protect the constitutional rights of the individual farm and ranch family, a lot of this other stuff is just white noise and is just using the government as a wish list, like Santa Claus, for things that might make our segment of the industry a little easier at the time.
Yeah, very good point. Well, Amanda, before we go here today, I had mentioned earlier that you were an author, you're a speaker. I know if folks are interested, they can go to your website and find more information about there. But I know you have quite a few kids' books that you put out there as well. Talk about that real quick, because that's something that, just not everybody does. And you've been doing it. You've got several out there. So talk about that real quick.
Yeah, well, I love getting out and speaking to people, and I take the books everywhere I go. So I know this will air hopefully this week for Independence Day, but in July, I will be speaking at the Stock Growers meeting in Rapid City, South Dakota. I'll be at a Farm Bureau meeting, Young Farmers and Ranchers meeting in St. Augustine, Florida. And then I'll also be at a beef direct-to-consumer sales training in Blacksburg, Virginia here in the upcoming month. So if you're any of those places or want to register and come visit with me in person, I would sure appreciate the opportunity to get to meet you and connect. But yeah, in 2011, I started writing children's books because I was really frustrated about the lack of accuracy in books and movies I saw. There was a movie called Barnyard where the cow walked on his back legs and he had an udder, but he was a dude. And, the farmer was the bad guy in the story. And I just remember thinking, like, this is how we're being portrayed. No wonder there's a whole generation of kids that are confused about where their food comes from. And so in 2011, my first book, Levi's Lost Calf, came out. And today I have 11 books out. 2 of them have been illustrated by my 10-year-old daughter, Scarlett. And so we've traveled the country. We've been everywhere from New York City to Los Angeles, reading these books to kids and teaching them about farm and ranch life. And one book I'll share, since it's Independence Day week and we're celebrating all things freedom. There's a book I have called Faith, Family, Freedom. It teaches all of the ideals that we hold dear in this country. And it's dedicated to a man, the late Bill Brody, who was a bonus grandpa to me. He was a Kansas cowboy, worked for Superior Auction, and he was a Vietnam War veteran, a Marine. And so he started a nonprofit organization I'm proud to support called the All-American Beef Battalion. It gives steaks to the troops as a way to say thank you. And purchasing this book, which you can find on amandaradke.com, goes to buy soldiers a steak. So you can learn more about that organization as well at steaksfortroops.com.
You bet. Well, Amanda, you're busy. I know amongst the books, the speaking, you and your husband and your family, your ranch, you also have a podcast called The Heart of Rural America that folks can tune into as well. So thank you again. And we'll have to do it again sometime. So
yes, anytime.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. Amanda Radke joining us here today on the program, as we talked about. Not only do her and her husband ranch near Mitchell, South Dakota, but she's also a very dynamic speaker, a great author of children's books as well. If you'd like to find out more information, maybe you have an organization you'd like to bring in Amanda to give a very dynamic talk to you in regards to agriculture and some of the different aspects that she is very well versed on, give her a call. Find out that contact information through her website at amandaradke.com. And oh, by the way, as we talked about as well, she has authored several children's books. You can find out all of that information through her website at amandaradke.com. Radke.com. Well, we haven't heard from him in quite a while, but after the break, we're going to hear from the Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor of Working Ranch Magazine, for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. This segment today brought to you by RioMax, the tub that pays for itself.
We've done a few manure studies on the RioMax product. On average, we're seeing 51% less undigested feed in cows' manure that have been on RioMax. She's digesting her feed that much better and getting that much more protein and that much more energy out of her feed stuff.
Basically, that saved 2 months worth of forage that we either would have grazed or we would have fed.
We just noticed that number of cows per day per acre probably increased 20 to 30%.
So we put RioMax on one set of cows and not the others. In the fall, when we wean those calves, we put the 2 sets of calves right together. There's a visual difference. I would say 35 or 40 pounds heavier.
I think we've increased our weaning weights at least 50 pounds.
Yeah, it's going to usually pay for itself.
RioMax, the tub that pays for itself.
To learn more, call 888-386-0699 or online at riomax.net.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. What a great country to live in, the United States of America. We're in our 250th year. I hope you guys are having the best 4th of July long weekend you've ever had. And Justin, I'm really happy that you got Amanda Radke on the show, because I got to tell you, she's a powerhouse. I really have a lot of respect for Amanda and all the things that she's done for the beef industry over like her career. It's amazing. So I'm glad you got her on, and keep her pretty close by. Okay, this is in the newspaper that I opened up here this morning. Mexico, U.S. to reopen border to cattle imports. Mexico and the United States said they would gradually reopen the United States border to cattle imports from Mexico in July, after U.S. ag officials suspended them in May over fears of the northward spread of the screwworm, agricultural officials in both countries said today. U.S. Ag Secretary Brooke Rollins said via X that key progress has been made. She noted that more than 100 million sterile flies were being dispersed weekly, and there had been no northward spread in 8 weeks. That's pretty good news, because I'll tell you what, that screwworm is a big deal. So as a lot of folks back in the 60s remember fighting it. Anyway, hope you had a great 4th, Justin, you and your family, and back to you in the booth.
All right, Captain, appreciate the update there. Good to hear from you as well. Yeah, in regards to the Mexican ports looking as though they're going to be reopening, it's definitely a topic that has some mixed reviews, as one would expect here in our industry, is the USDA releasing that 5-pronged plan approach to fight the screwworm. Part of that's going to include bolstering sterile fly production by renovating a facility in Mexico, and then they also plan to build a new fly dispersal facility at Moore Air Base in southern Texas. It will be a phased reopening is what we're hearing, as they will start from the west, moving to the east on that. And Mexico, while they have done a lot of work refining in its response, there's still some work to be done, some feel, and also some concern in regard to that there will not be a quarantine period for cattle once they do come into the United States from Mexico. Now, of course, they will have to be identified, because each animal that does come in from Mexico does have to be identified. But another concern I've heard too is that APHIS really not communicating what a preparation plan should be if the number of active cases in Mexico increase or it spreads northward. So I think it's definitely still a topic that's hot on everybody's agenda. We'll keep track of it here on the Working Ranch Radio Show as well. And of course, for those of you that are regular listeners to the Working Ranch Radio Show, you know that the Captain Tim O'Byrne is editor of Working Ranch Magazine, has been for several years, and the summer edition of Working Ranch Magazine is out, as always, every issue full of a lot of great stories and articles that are extremely relevant to those in the ranching industry. And if you don't have a subscription, you can go to the website at workingranchmag.com and start your subscription today. Or it's also a simple way, stop by your local Tractor Supply store. You can pick one right up off the shelf. And a shout out here today to the Tractor Supply store in Cumberland, Maryland, in Oak Ridge, North Carolina, and in Ukiah, California, and in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. Stay with us. When we come back, meteorologist Don Day steps in as we take a look at our long-range weather.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
And joining us now with a look at our long-term weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, as we are now fully in the month of July, we've actually seen some weather across the country. Mainly, when I say that, I should probably say more in the southwestern part of the country, seen some monsoon activity taking place. But as we get into this first part of July, kind of seeing a break in action compared to what we've had.
Yeah, we've had a lot of weather here over the last couple of weeks. We had the big heat dome in the central and the east. We have seen significant rains move into the northern and northwest areas of the Corn Belt. And then you mentioned the North American monsoon brought more rain to New Mexico and Arizona and parts of the Intermountain West and even parts of the Great Basin. So that's all good to see. But as we take a look at the week ahead, you know what it looks like? It looks like July. We're going to have some heat. We're going to have some thunderstorm activity. There's really nothing that's out of kilter. But across some parts of the nation, there will be some different things happening.
Okay. So when we look at that, one of the things you and I were talking about before we started here today was the fact that really the West, and I'm going to say more like California, the West Coast side of things, hasn't really seen the heat that typically they would have had this time of the year, but that's going to change a bit.
It is going to change a bit. They have had a relatively cool start to the summer. So when you've heard the news about heat waves, it's been along the East Coast or in the Midwest, but you haven't heard about California heat. We're going to get a little bit of that here over the next week or so as we don't see anything excessive, but with the monsoon moisture flow kind of taking a bit of a break, California, the Great Basin states, and part of the Pacific Northwest are going to be pretty warm. And with that will also be pretty dry conditions. We'd like to see, some chances of rain get into the Pacific Northwest, but we don't see much of that. So we are watching some very dry areas there. We also see a pattern developing temperature-wise in the nation's midsection that looks, pretty much as you would expect it to be towards the middle of July. It is going to be warmer, but what we don't see that excessive heat. If we were to probably look at the warmest weather relative to average, it'll be over south central Canada, parts of the Northern Rockies and Northern Plains where there will be some heat building up here over the next week or so.
Okay, so another thing that we really haven't got into, we've heard a little bit of rumblings of some tropical storms, some names coming in there. I think the last one I heard was in the Fs. So, but you say that's going to start to pick up a little bit.
Yeah, we've had Hurricane Flossie out in the Pacific off the coast of Mexico. Thankfully, that's harmlessly drifting out to sea and weakening, and it is not going to be much of a factor. But we have a bit of a tropical depression that has been forming off the coast of Florida. Starting to see that I think the Gulf region and the southeastern part of the U.S. needs to be watched a little bit more. Water temperatures there are really warm, and we kind of have a pattern set up that in the east and southeastern areas of the United States that here in the month of July, we may end up with some tropical activity, whether it's a depression or tropical storm. Not saying there'll be a hurricane, but we're starting to see things get a little bit more active down there, as you would expect as we get deeper and deeper into the warm season.
Okay, so just to kind of finish up here today, as we look ahead into the rest of July, maybe first part of and hitting into the dead center of the summer months. I think we had talked about earlier when we were doing a show several months ago, there was some forecasts of a hotter summer. And I mean, of course, the physicality of where that's going to be and where it's not going to be. Just in general, are we in line with where you were expecting summer just weather, or is there anything askew that's different?
Well, I think what's going to end up happening from what we're seeing is it's not going to be nearly as hot from start to finish in the Midwest and the Corn Belt. I think the forecasts of excessive heat there have been way overdone. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we just have more subtropical, more monsoonal moisture coming on through there. We've seen a lot of the soil moisture profiles improve dramatically in the northern and northwest Corn Belt. And that kind of acts as a governor to keep temperatures from getting too hot. And also, there's some indications that for parts of the central and eastern United States, I don't see necessarily a big heat dome coming back in like what we saw at the end of June. So I guess that's one thing is that I don't think it's going to be as hot or as dry as some of the earlier forecasts for the summer have had forecasted. So at the end of the day, I think it's going to end up being a pretty average summer in a lot of places.
Okay. All right. Well, Don, appreciate being here. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Sounds good.
And that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather across the country. If you want to tune in each and every morning to his daily video podcast, you can find the link by going to his website at dayweather.com. Hey, as we head to break, just thinking here a little bit as we head into this time of year where we're going to start to see a little bit more drier conditions. For those folks that have been dry, you're thinking, well, what do you mean? We've already been there. However, for other parts of the country, when we get into the summer times of the month, knowing what's going on with your water supply system is awfully important to these cattle. In fact, as we talked about last week in our show with Ted Perry, with Purina, talking about how important water is to the nutrition for these animals. Well, if you want to do what we've been doing here on our ranching operations for the last several years, using Tank Toad as the mechanism to keep track of our water supply, we can keep track through our cell phones there, through the use of getting a text of where the status is on your cistern tank, or maybe it's your stock tank. It can be powered solar wise, so you don't even have to be close to the grid to be able to run one of these. If you're in a very remote area, they have the ways of doing that with satellite, or if you're in an area that has cellular connection, you can do that via cell as well. Keep an eye on your water supply each day with text messages. If you'd like to find out more about Tank Toad, they've got everything from tank monitors, cistern monitors, well controllers, generators, and more. Give them a call at 801-252-6135. You can find out more information by going to their website at tanktoad.com.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
We've done a few manure studies on the Real Max product. On average, we're seeing 51% less undigested feed in cows' manure that have been on Real Max. She's digesting her feed that much better and getting that much more protein and that much more energy out of her feed stock.
Generally figure about 5.5 to 6 acres a pair. Through the drought of 2020, we did 4.5 acres a pair on ours, still had adequate grass left.
I guess they utilize more of what they eat, so they eat less.
We were actually able to increase the number of cattle that we were running probably by 30%. With the same amount of grass.
We had a worse drought this year, worse heat this year. Weaned them a whole month earlier. They weighed at least 100 to 150 pounds more this year, and my cows had pones on them. The only thing different is the Real Max tub.
Real Max, the tub that pays for itself.
To learn more, call 888-386-0699 or online at realmax.net. For a lot of us, we have very fond memories of participating or even attending our local and or state fairs across the country. However, as our society continues to be further and further removed from production agriculture, the support for these venues and these organizations start to fade. How do we protect them going forward to protect our American heritage and our agricultural way of life? That's on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Thanks for tuning in this week. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.